Hello and welcome to another Dungeons & Dragons session dramatization set in the world of Alter Aeon. Our protagonists are Kara the War Mage, Morden the Hexblade, Tess the Sorceress, and Sened the Favored Soul. I am Shadowfax, the Dungeon Master. So an interesting question was posed to me in this session that made me pause and have to think of a good answer. My sister-in-law asked me what ghosts are afraid of, and I was absolutely stumped. I had her make a knowledge arcana check to see if her character knew the answer, and she easily made the check, so then I really did have to give her a good answer. Finally, I came up with the illusion that her character uses in the final fight of this session, but I liked the idea she came up with after the session was over even better. So what would a ghost really be afraid of? The answer: an army of clerics. When we last left our heroes, they had discovered that the mayor of Vamarken, Bartleby Corinthian Cogsworth, was dead. The well-dressed gnome was slumped over a desk in the great room, and the place had been ransacked. Sened studied the wounds on the body, and asked to see the maul that Morden had taken from Gilbert. He confirmed that it was the murder weapon. The quartet examined the clutter on the floor, but things had been tossed about so much that they couldn't determine what exactly Gilbert had been looking for. Kara and Tess searched the remaining rooms of the house. Tess didn't find anything in the kitchen area, but in the bedroom, Kara found a middle-aged human woman in a nightgown, face down on the bed, and called for Sened. Sened hurried back and examined the body, announcing that she was alive but unconscious. He applied some ointment to her bruises, laid her on her back, and cast a lesser vigor spell. About a minute later, her eyes fluttered, and she began to wake up. The woman didn't recognize Kara, Tess, or Sened, and was frightened of them at first, but Sened reassured her that he was a priest and had just healed her. Tess broke the unpleasant news to her that the mayor was dead. When they asked her who had assaulted her, she said that she didn't know. She had been struck from behind and never saw her attacker. At this point, Morden left to report back to Rodnar what they had found. The woman, whose name was Charlista, was the mayor's wife, and she asked to see her husband. The three escorted her to the great room. As one would expect, she began to weep upon seeing his dead body. Kara consoled her, while Tess prepared a snack in the kitchen with the hope of comforting the grieving widow. Sened did his best to start cleaning up the messy room. Meanwhile, Morden had made it back to the blacksmith shop and found Gilbert chained to the forge, with a boy sitting nearby watching him. Morden had the boy fetch his father and informed him of the situation with the mayor and his wife. Rodnar asked Morden how their maid was doing, but Morden said that they hadn't seen her. The two headed out and started toward the other side of town. Back at the mayor's house, two men wearing the garb of the Vamarken town guard entered the front door, which had been left open. The leader was Guard Captain Soval, a tall man clad in full-plate armor and a closed helm, carrying a halberd. At first he was quite suspicious of the presence of Kara, Tess, and Sened in the mayor's house, but Charlista quickly vouched for them. The three relayed to Soval what had happened with Gilbert, and Soval informed them that he and the other town guards had been out in the marshes hunting down a bandit that had fired arrows at the sentry manning the east gate. They caught him, and they also caught 7 of his allies heading out the south gate while the guards were on their way back into town. Soval ordered the man to stay with the mayor's wife and asked Kara, Tess, and Sened to come with him to the town square and identify the prisoners. Morden entered the town square just as Kara, Tess, and Sened were arriving. They saw the 8 prisoners, all clad in orange armor, tied together with a pair of guards grimly looking over them. One of the other town councilors, Edna, the apothecarist, had been summoned and had taken charge of the situation. She praised Kara, Morden, Tess, and Sened for their role in thwarting Gilbert's conspiracy, and said that they could go to bed, and that she'd be by in the morning to talk with them. By the time our heroes returned to the Vimarcan mercenary guild house, it was the wee hours of the morning. Not feeling entirely safe, they decided that one of them should stay awake to keep watch. Morden took the first shift, while the girls slept in Gilbert's bed, and Sened slept on the floor. They took turns sleeping and keeping watch, but nothing happened besides the sun rising outside. Later that morning, the group had all woken up, and were helping themselves to the guild larder, when the 3 town councilors arrived to speak with them. They knew Rodner and Edna already, and were introduced to the 3rd councilman, a barrister named Boris Muscovy. Boris worked for the Barristers Guild in Indira that handled all legal matters for Vimarcan. They informed our heroes that Gilbert's trial and that of the other men would begin in a few hours, and that they needed their help. Boris said that he had a prior legal arrangement with Gilbert and was contractually obligated to come to his defense in any legal proceedings. He therefore could not serve as the prosecutor. The other counselors were leery of serving in that capacity, as legal matters were not their forte. Apparently they had visited Valerio before stopping in, and the high priest had recommended that one Tessiara Topaz could fill the role. They offered her 15 gold, and she graciously accepted the offer. Boris provided a crash course on Vimarcan law, part of which meant Tess being subject to the same Zone of Truth spell as witnesses while questioning them. Refusal to answer a question under such circumstances was tantamount to an admission of guilt. Rodner and Edna would act as judges and determine guilt and punishments, and the trial would be held publicly in the town square. The town councilors then asked if the other 3 could provide extra security during the trial. The militia would shut the town gates, but there were more gates than guards to watch them. They offered 30 gold, and Morden and the others agreed. At noon, the trial began. Beforehand, Kara went into the town hall and up to the 2nd floor that served as the meeting place for the town's fledgling mage guild. She positioned herself on a balcony overlooking the town square. Fernando climbed onto the roof of the general store opposite of Kara and kept watch from that vantage. Morden and Sened stayed within the gathered onlookers, taking care to watch the movements of the people within the crowd. The proceedings of the Anaranjados were short. 7 of the 8 were quickly judged to be guilty of murder and conspiracy, and were sentenced to death by beheading. The other gang member was the one who had fired arrows at the gate and hid in the nearby blue marshes. Since he hadn't actually hurt anyone, he was found guilty of assault and sentenced to exile. Now it was Gilbert's turn to be tried. The charges of murder, attempted murder, and criminal trespass were read out. Wearing her most extravagant dress, Tess took center stage in order to present her opening argument. She first stated that there should have been one more charge brought against Gilbert: kidnapping. Without objection from Boris, Rodner and Edna agreed with Tess and had the kidnapping charge added to the list. Tess made a passionate speech to the court, promising to deliver overwhelming evidence to prove Gilbert's guilt. The first witness was called to the stand: Pilar. Pilar's body had been seated upright in a chair, carefully groomed and dressed with clean clothing to provide some semblance of life. A bonnet was placed over her head to conceal the massive head trauma that she had received. Her father, the high priest, cast Speak with Dead on the body, and Tess asked her who had killed her. She answered that she didn't know. She had had a sack tied over her head. Despite that small initial setback, the rest of the trial went rather smoothly for Tess. The body of Mayor Bartleby was made up in a similar fashion to that of Pilar, and when questioned, he definitively said that it was Gilbert, the mercenary guildmaster, who had killed him. Rodnar then read aloud incriminating portions of the letters that El Zapato had sent Gilbert, translating them to common so everyone present could understand. The high priest then cast Zone of Truth. The bartender of the Sheep and Shovel and his daughter testified against Gilbert. But the most withering testimony against Gilbert was that of Gilbert himself. Compelled by the Zone of Truth spell, Gilbert had no choice but to answer Tess's questions honestly. She asked if he had killed Pilar, and, dejectedly, he answered yes. She asked if he had killed Bartleby, and he said yes. She asked who had assaulted Charlista, and he answered that he had. Finally, Tess asked if he had conspired with El Zapato and the Anaranjados to attack Vimarcan, to which he responded yes. Tess reminded everyone present that the attack on the town had cost the lives of the mayor and 2 guardsmen, and that Gilbert should be judged accordingly. Boris's only defense against the accusations was to bring to light that one Franco Zapato, also known as El Zapato, actually owned the mercenary guild hall. Gilbert had a rent-to-own arrangement and made regular payments. Boris suggested that the Anaranjados use this influence over Gilbert to coerce him into acting in their plans and betraying the town of Vimarcan. He further insinuated that the gang may have been blackmailing him. Since the Zone of Truth was still in effect, Tess asked Gilbert if anyone was blackmailing him, and he said no. She rested her case. Boris had nothing more to say. Rodnar and Edna found Gilbert guilty on all charges and sentenced him to death by beheading. The execution would take place later that day at sunset. After the crowd dispersed, Kara, Morden, Tess, and Sened all met in the town hall with Rodnar. Morden asked about the matter of the mercenary guild hall ownership. Rodnar revealed that the deed for the building wasn't in Gilbert's name, but in the name of the guild itself. He further reasoned that since Franco Zapato was dead, that there was no one to pay, and that the town would consider the debt settled. Morden was unsure, but Rodnar reassured him that everything was in order, and that the guild hall was now his to do with as he pleased. That being the case, Morden asked the blacksmith to have the front door lock changed, and Rodnar said that one of his apprentices would be by later in the afternoon with his best door lock. Upon hearing Morden's request for 4 keys, Sened asked him, "Does this mean that I am a mercenary now?" Morden said yes. Yes, it did. Sened smiled, intrigued by the notion of being a mercenary priest. Although he figured that any danger of interference had passed, Rodnar did ask Morden to keep an eye on things during the execution. Back at the Vimarcan Mercenary Guild Hall, our heroes discussed their next move. Kara expressed interest in helping Sened take the Sunlight Staff to Pelham. Morden said that he wanted to see the execution first, and Sened said that while he was eager to get the staff where it belonged, he wanted to attend the wake that had been scheduled the next day for the mayor and fallen guardsmen. Morden went through the paperwork that Gilbert had left in his desk to try and find out if there were any more guild members. He found copies of 3 outstanding contracts. There was one for a Char Featherstep, who had been tasked with hunting down a witch in Gochalandia. Another was for someone named Gronk, who apparently was on special assignment for the Baron of Indira. The third was for Grombash of Grumsh, who apparently was escorting Saltash, Gilbert's wife, to Pelham, along with a cleric from the Vimarcan shrine named Leticia. The date on the contract was for 3 days prior. When twilight arrived, Kara, Morden, and Sened went over to the town square to observe the execution. Tess was uninterested in witnessing the gruesome display and had stayed behind. There was an even larger crowd than that for the trial. They found Holly, the bartender's daughter, in the crowd, who expressed with great glee how much she loved watching bad guys get punished. Guard Captain Soval acted as the headsman. He grabbed one of the Anaranjado prisoners by the shirt and forced him to kneel before the execution block. He hefted his halberd, but before he could administer justice, a battle cry rang out from the crowd behind our heroes. "Grombash bash!" An orc clad in a shining breastplate wielding an orc double axe, barreled through the crowd and slapped Sovo across the face with the flat of one of his axe blades. Two other men clad in long brown robes drew their short swords and rushed forward to aid the orc. Morden and Sened advanced on the orc, presumably named Grombash, while Kara cast Ice Knife at one of his allies, showering his body with razor-sharp spikes of ice and taking him out of the fight. Morden hexed the orc and took a swing at him, but Grombash ignored him and rained down a mighty blow upon the chain, binding Gilbert to the other prisoners. The sound of the chain shattering was ear-splitting, and Fernando managed to hear it while down the street and inside of a building. He alerted his mistress to the commotion, and Tess went outside to see what was going on. It looked like Gilbert was getting up. Well, he wasn't going to get away if Tess had anything to say about it. She let him have it from behind, pelting him with a pair of invisible missiles. Since no one had tended to Gilbert's health after he was captured, that was enough to take him down, this time for good. Gilbert fell flat on his face, dead as a doornail. Meanwhile, Grombash's remaining ally had moved forward to duel with Sovo and was losing. Sened knocked the guy upside the head, while Morden doggedly pursued Grombash, who was hightailing it out of there. Kara blasted him with another ice knife spray, but he started charging south through the crowd. He might have thought that he was clearing a path for Gilbert, but a glance over his shoulder proved that Gilbert wasn't behind him like he had thought. In spite of this, the orc kept running. Grombash managed to survive another spell from Kara, this time Kelgor's firebolt. Morden was fast, but Grombash was faster, and just when it looked like he was going to escape, Morden cast Expeditious Retreat on himself for a boost of speed, quickly caught up to Grombash, and hammered the orc down to the ground, ending his flight and his life. Our heroes turned their attention back to the prisoners, who Guard Captain Sovo was unceremoniously cutting down in short order before they could try to escape. While the Guard Captain broke up the crowd, the quartet looted the corpses of Grombash and those with him. Besides some gold they found, a couple of cure potions. Kara kept one of the short swords, Morden took Grombash's masterwork sling and bullets, and Sened took Grombash's magic breastplate. They sold the other weapons to Rodnar and headed to bed. The next morning was bright and cheery. The group had finally gotten a full night's sleep, and they all felt better for it. There was a knock on the door during breakfast, and Morden opened the front door to find Holly there with a cart full of food. She said that she made the delivery about this time every month, and that he owed her 70 gold pieces. He paid her, and after unloading the food, she hung around the guild hall chatting with her heroes until it was time for the wake to start. With Holly in tow, the quartet headed over to the town square to see the coffins being carried out of the Vimarcan shrine by a young female cleric, as directed by Valerio. The high priest overheard the group talking to one another and approached them. They asked him if Pilar's body was going to be on display, but the priest shamefully answered no, even if he managed to collect enough donations to have her raised. He doubted that she would respond, given the circumstances of her death. He then asked them to see him after the wake, as he had a job for them to do. The coffins were opened, and visitation began. As was tradition, visitors placed donations in the open coffins. Most people would put the money towards purchasing a burial plot and having the grave consecrated, as was the case with the slain guardsmen. But if enough money could be collected, survivors could have their loved ones raised from the dead. Between the money she had saved and what had been collected during the wake, Charlista managed to obtain enough money to buy a raise dead spell for her husband, the mayor. Although it would be many days before a cleric of sufficient skill to cast the spell could arrive, and before the required amount of diamond dust could be obtained. After the coffins were put back in the cleric guild hall for safekeeping, Valerio told the group about the job he wanted them to do. He asked that they take his daughter's body to be buried in their family's ancestral tomb in Campo Verde. He offered them 50 gold pieces and suggested that his apprentice, Leticia, could go with them. Morden asked why they needed a cleric, and Sinet explained that it was well known that the road between Pelham and Vimarken crossed over the River Tuy, and the bridge there was haunted and had been for many years. However, Sinet insisted that they could do the job without Leticia. Not only did the Sunlight Staff give him the power to turn undead like a cleric, he did not trust Leticia. Noting that, Morden took the opportunity to query Leticia about her trip with Saltash and Grombash. Leticia reported that they did not act unusual during the trip. Saltash seemed excited to visit her family, and Grombash never mentioned anything about Gilbert. When she and Grombash arrived back in town yesterday, he had left her at the shrine, and that was it. After much discussion, the group decided to accept the job, but declined the assistance of Leticia. They returned to their guild hall while Valerio made preparations. As Morden drew up a contract, Kara and Tess asked Sinet to tell them more about the haunted bridge. Sinet said that the ghost that haunted the bridge had the appearance of an innocent boy, but was in fact quite dangerous. The spirit would attack and murder anyone that tried to cross the bridge. It was standard practice to bring a cleric to turn the spirit whenever the bridge had to be crossed, which limited travel between Pelham and Vimarken. Sinet said that the spirit had been destroyed several times before, but it always returned between 1 and 4 days later, behaving as if nothing ever happened to it. Kara and Morden both brought up the subject of taking the Sunlight Staff to the Pelham Reliquary like Sinet had wanted, and Sinet said that it was practically on the way to Campo Verde, and he could drop it off either on the way there or on the way back. Soon there was a knock at the door, and the group found Valerio outside with a handcart. The body of Pilar was in it. The high priest asked Kara if she still had Pilar's robe, and she did. He bought it back from her for 1 gold piece, and placed the robe on the body over top her other clothes. He then removed the 2 copper pieces that covered her eyes, renewed the gentle repose spell that kept her from decomposing, and replaced the pennies. He briefly caressed her face one last time, and then covered her with a blanket. Morden quickly read the contract to Valerio. He agreed to the arrangement and paid Morden. He then handed Morden a list of instructions on how to find his family's tomb and how to properly inter Pilar's body. He said that they would find in the cart a vial of holy water and 5 pounds of silver dust. With some hesitation, he called for Sinet and handed him a magic scroll, telling him that it had the consecrate spell on it. Without further ado, our heroes put some supplies in the cart, locked up the guild hall, and were off. They waved to Rodner's children as they left Vimarken through the west gate. The path to Pelham was a narrow dirt road, and they had to walk single file to all stay on it. Morden pulled the cart, and the other 3 followed him. The forest in the interior of the island was much thicker than that of the Greenwood, and the overhead tree branches formed a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. They encountered many harmless woodland creatures, such as woodchucks, hares, and muskrats. Songbirds chirped from the trees, and there were quite a lot of crows about. Having started their journey around noon, they drew near to the haunted bridge as the sun began to set. Sure enough, there was a little boy, around 6 or 7 years old, standing on the path in front of the bridge with a fishing pole in his hand, looking perfectly innocent and ordinary. When he spotted the party's approach, he immediately ran up to them, yelling joyful greetings. Sinet raised his holy symbol and the Sunlight Staff, but Tess pulled his arm back that she wanted to try and talk to it. She engaged the spirit in small talk, asking him what he was doing all out alone. He cheerfully replied that he was fishing, and that the bridge was the best fishing spot around for miles. When Tess asked if his parents would worry about him since it was getting late, he assured her that his parents let him stay out as long as he liked. Kara asked him if he'd like to see a dead body, and the boy eagerly said yes. She lifted up the blanket covering Pilar's body, and the spirit remarked how cool it was before inviting them all to come up onto the bridge with him. Since the ghost continued to play coy, Tess tried another line of questioning to coax the truth out of him. She asked him how long he'd been out on the bridge, but he didn't seem to know how to answer that question. He just kept inviting them to come up onto the bridge and fish with him. Kara was growing impatient, so she then tried to intimidate the spirit into revealing its true nature. She walked over to the edge of the bridge. It appeared to be a covered bridge made of wood, but the side railings were badly warped and broken in places. She lit a torch and threatened to burn down the bridge if the ghost didn't start dealing with them honestly. Interacting with the bridge, however, revealed to Kara that its appearance was an illusion. The bridge actually was full of large holes, and that the side railings were the only things that looked solid. Even so, the threat of burning the bridge down enraged the spirit, and it became translucent. It began hovering in the air. It flew up to Kara to attack her. Morden cast magic weapon on his maul, and advanced to assist Kara. Sined knew that it was time to act. With his holy symbol in one hand and the sunlight staff in the other, he raised both hands and yelled, "Denton commands you to leave." Nothing happened. He tried a second time, saying, "The power of Denton compels you." Still, nothing. Meanwhile, Tess attempted to de-escalate the situation so she could try talking to the spirit again, but things had gotten out of hand. Kara was casting her most potent attack spells, and Morden was beating on the spirit with his enchanted maul. Since turning didn't seem to do any good, Sined also advanced on the spirit, using his cure spells to damage it. Most of the ghost's fury was reserved for Kara, and it did manage to strike her down in spite of being hexed by Morden. Sined disengaged and stepped behind Morden to reach her, casting Vigor to heal her. While she was down, the spirit carved a big chunk out of Morden, nearly bringing him down as well. Although she was disappointed that she would be unable to solve the mystery behind the haunted bridge, it pained Tess to see her friends be hurt. She cast an illusion to try and confuse the ghost, making it look like the sun was coming back up, but the spirit saw right through it. Combat lasted for a minute or so more, with Kara, Morden, and Sined crowded around the ghost, all attacking it. At first, the spirit seemed delighted for the chance to fight, grinning wildly, but as the battle dragged on, the ghost's expression became more sorrowful and desperate, yet it would not back down, despite repeated requests from Tess. For the most part, Morden's hex staved off the ghost's most powerful attacks, but he and Kara each had to use a healing potion to stay in the fight. Ultimately, it was a magic missile spell from Tess that extinguished it. Clinging to the side rails, the group safely traversed the bridge, with Morden carrying the handcart above his head as he crossed, and they looked westward toward Pelham. And that is where our session ended. Please like the video and subscribe to our channel to continue following the story of our heroes. Transcripts of our Dungeons & Dragons sessions are available at www.lawful-evil.org/DND. If you enjoyed this and don't already play the game this is based on, you can explore the world of Alter Aeon for yourself by visiting www.alteraeon.com. Remember, the family that plays together stays together. Thanks for listening, and happy mudding, everybody.
Alteraeon.com. That's ALTERAEON.com.